Although, with that said, it is a particularly interesting question. Because is it that Gen Z figured out something that the millennials didn't? Is it the way the millennials were raised that, has affected us? Is it something this, that, and the other that could have affected the fact that
the royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who likes his women the same exact way he likes his yogurt. He is also a man who may include skipping leg day to his cardio routine. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. And I am here to talk about bonding. Because, it's not just in the chemistry. Even though, whenever you people bond, sometimes people consider that you have really good chemistry. But all in all, it is mainly about the bonds. I do want to talk about the bonds between parent and child, or supposed parent and child. I also want to talk about the bonds that are keeping a generation together while not keeping another generation together. And, hopefully at some point we'll try and make some sense out of all of it, because that's a lot to say, and I don't know if I have enough time. But as usual, I will try my best to deliver as much as I can within the time period that I have. And should you like it, should you not like it, should you have a different form of feedback, or should you want to suggest a potential topic or guest for the podcast, then as always, the social media links are in the description below. They rarely ever change, and I would be more than happy to receive your DMs and, handle them accordingly. And I hope you listen all the way till the end of the episode, because it's nice. And I put some good shit there, especially in the conclusion. But all in all, thank you so much for listening. And like I said, I hope you listen all the way till the end. And I should definitely get the show on the road. Although, before I do that, like I said in the previous episode, after this episode, I will be going on break for about 2-3 weeks. And normally whenever I'm on break, it's not like I leave you guys high and dry. There's always going to be shorter bits of content, somewhere around 12 to 17 minutes. Just mainly carrying some of the thoughts that I have and some of the discussions that I didn't have as I was doing this season. But essentially, it's just going to be shorter, no instrumentals, very, very little editing, just some simple work where I basically go and air out some of my thoughts on certain things. So just a reminder that I wanted to give there before I get into everything, because I know it'll be hard to kind of explain that further down the road. So for those that didn't know, now you know, and for those that already knew, I guess now you know a little bit more. But with that said, I definitely do need to get into the meat of the episode, and I want to kick things off by talking about DNA testing, more so paternity DNA testing. Now, normally it's not something that people talk about as much, even though it is something that men usually speak on in whispers. Mainly because there's a lot of guys out here, and this is something that some people have even proven statistically in certain parts of the world, who are basically raising children that aren't theirs. And it is something that we as men have sort of spoken about, but it's not something that gets that much airplay. So a lot of times people start to talk about it. Maybe it might get, some virality, or people might talk about it as a point of discussion. But slowly over time, it just, kind of dies off and people try to not talk about it. But essentially, there are a lot of cases where, there are men who are just raising children that aren't theirs. Now, a certain doctor, or should I say person, by the name of Peter Ngumba has basically been championing for DNA tests online. Alright, and he has been very open and vocal about going to do DNA tests and how men should be doing DNA tests to discover that the children are actually theirs, or the child is actually theirs. Because there's a lot of men out here that are getting played, and we need more honesty out here in these streets. People need to stop fucking around and then bringing the kids for, guys to raise them. And while the guy has been championing it, there was a bit of an incident about a week or two ago where the guy was kind of caught in a bind because he decided to do the DNA test for his daughter that's about 2 years old, and apparently he found out that he is not the father of his 2-year-old daughter, which is a wild situation. That is absolutely wild. It's like being a pastor telling people not to sin or sleep around, but then you discover that your wife has been fucking around. That's the wild shit. But this is even worse because it's DNA testing. And, a lot of people kind of were in the comments, and it was kind of two-way, where some people were just laughing at the guy, While other people were saying that it was scripted, the guy did come out later on and say that it wasn't for Clout, it wasn't a Clout thing, it is actually true. And whether his situation is believed or not, or if it's true or not, I think is entirely up for debate out here, but I do like the fact that the guy basically brought up the idea of paternity testing and he wants it to be a more common thing. Now, personally, I am a very big believer that paternity testing should be mandatory, just so that we can minimize the number of cases where a man finds out that the children that he's been raising for, 18, 20, sometimes even 30 years aren't their children. And while I know there's some people that say that, it doesn't matter all that much, like children should all be like loved and cared for and they're sacred, blah, blah. Like, I still feel like this is a way in which men are very disadvantaged. And for the most part, the world doesn't really seem to give a shit. Or at least some parts of the Western world don't really give a shit. Now, of course, a lot of the people that talk about how, that all our children, like, just bring them in and, like, just take care of them. Or, like, it's a kid that's already there, just take care of the kid. I don't think y'all actually understand how bad this is. Like, the thought that there's a man out there that went screwed your partner and, left them with a kid. So not only did they screw them, they screwed them raw and nutted inside and the kid came out of it. But now they basically left that kid for you to take care of. Like, personally, I find that to be very diabolically wild, and honestly, like, I don't even know whether to look at it as malicious or just bad, but it's hard to actually describe how very, like, annoying and frustrating and painful it is for a man to go through such a thing and then find out later on that they were taking care of someone else's kid. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that every child should receive love, alright? I also believe that even if a child isn't yours, your ability to love and take care of them and nurture them as your own shouldn't be something that should be that big of an issue, provided that you know that this is not your child and you are perfectly okay with raising that child even though it is not biologically yours. But now my issue comes in when people talk about, or at least when people bring up culture and they try to use it to justify such a thing, because people talk about how, back in the day, there was this thing. So depending on which cultures, women were told not to have children by just one man. They can go and have children by multiple men. In some cultures, it was even okay. No one really gave a damn. Provided that the woman has kids and it's your wife, those are your children to take care of. Like, there are some cultures that would allow for that. There were other cultures that would basically say, you know what, even though that kid is for someone else, like, all of the children are children of the community. And it made sense at that time because the community was basically helping you raise the child, or should I say raise all the children, because in as much as there were biological parents, there was still the rest of the community as grown-ups that would basically do their part in trying to line up the kids and also discipline them if need be, and also take care of these children. But now the issue comes in when we are beyond that level. The sense of community is barely there now. Most people are living very individual lives, and it's not like the entire community is trying to take care of this kid as far as feeding the kid, taking the kid to school, paying bills and shit. And it's not like everyone is chipping in trying to raise the kid, because if you're having issues with, like, let's say you have 2, 3, 4 kids, or even though you have a kid and you're unable to sort out bills, people will genuinely ask you, why did you get the kid? If you chose to get the kid, and usually it'll be the guy that'll be asked that, like, if you chose to get the kid, then why the hell are you coming to us? That's your kid, so it's your problem, it's not ours. It's not our responsibility to raise your kid. So now imagine, as a man, you've gone through all of that ridicule, you've been told that by people because you were struggling and you're trying to raise this kid, and then years later you find out that not only have you been putting effort and sacrificing for someone that might not be that grateful to you or even grateful at all, but on top of that, that kid isn't even yours. Like, do you know how much of a blow that is to a man? Like, that shit is actually genuinely serious. And this whole decision of, let's just sweep it under the rug and make it not happen, or act like this actually isn't the reality, is something that I feel is a cop-out by a lot of people, whether you're calling it society, whether you're calling it certain governments, so that they can prevent the bullshit that already started this in the first place, which should have been nipped in the bud a long time ago. And I say this because there's certain parts of the world where paternity testing is actually an issue. So, like for example, in France, the only way you can get a paternity test is for either medical, judicial, or I think scientific reasons. You as the father are not allowed to go and get a paternity test for your kid just because you want to. In Germany, you are required to get the consent of your partner, or at least of the other parent, for you to get a paternity test. And I'm like, is it just me, or are these guys perfectly okay with the idea of paternity fraud? Because when you think about it, these guys know very well that shit like this happens. Like, statistically, France has some of the highest rates of infidelity that we hear of on a statistical level, where I think 5 out of 10 men and 4 out of 10 women engage in infidelity, which is wild. So these guys know that there's a ton of infidelity that's happening, and apparently they don't want the family structure to break down, and they don't want arguments in the house and, separations and divorces and shit. So instead of saying that it should be mandatory so that there's fewer people that fuck up and, go screw around with other people and give someone else the kid to take care of, they're like, you know what? Let's just sweep this under the rug and make it illegal for someone to go and just get a paternity test kit, or go and do a paternity test for their kid simply because they want to know. And it's shit like this that reminds me that while there's feminists out here busy talking all sorts of shit about, the oppression of women and shit, like, guys out here are the ones that are really going through oppression. Guys out here are the ones that are really, really going through it. And it's shit like this that hammers in the fact that people don't really care about men, to be honest. If they did, paternity fraud would actually be a real issue. But then again, maybe that's just me, and maybe I'm just being emotional about this shit. So I am going to leave it at that and move it on to our main topic of this episode. Now, this one isn't about the kid. This one is more towards the marriage side of it. And yes, I know you don't need to be married to have a kid. We've seen enough examples of that. But, usually, like, the ultimate step for a lot of people whenever it comes to relationships is marriage. But apparently, it seems like there's a generation that seems to be falling behind, supposedly or allegedly, when it comes to marrying, and another generation seems to be doing it a lot faster, or seems to be doing it a lot more. Now, while I was on Reddit about a day or two ago, I stumbled across a particularly interesting post, which involved a guy busy asking why it is that millennials are marrying so much later than Gen Zs, and if there's, a real trend around this, or if there's actually an issue. And when I kind of sat and I thought about it, in the past, 2-3 years, I think I know more of my friends or acquaintances or associates that are Gen Z who've gotten married than my millennial friends. And I don't say this in like a way to say that, what I've gone through is a representation of reality, but it was something that kind of did come up once. And the interesting part about it is, like, this is something that I've had discussions with a lot of people, where they're like, how is it that Gen Z seem to be getting married a lot faster, or they're just getting married and a lot more of them are getting married as opposed to millennials? Like, what is it that they have or they're doing that we're not? And while I've danced around the issue, it's not like it's something that I've ever really discussed, and I'm not gonna lie, I have kind of tried to avoid discussing it until now, where I actually do want to get into that discussion. So the title of the post was, why are millennials marrying so much later than Gen Z? Is it just TikTok hype or a real trend? Now, I am going to read the article, then give my thoughts on it. So it says, and I quote, I'm seeing a constant stream of young Gen Z couples getting married and seemingly hacking, quote unquote, the traditional life timeline on my social media feeds. This is a massive contrast to my own millennial cohort, where a huge chunk of people in their mid to late 30s are still unmarried, having postponed marriage due to factors like pursuing career stability, crushing debt, and waiting for the quote unquote perfect financial moment. We were taught to prioritize career and independence first, which often meant delaying commitment indefinitely, turning ready into an ever-moving goalpost. This raises a fascinating question. Why the apparent shift for Gen Z? Are they viewing the current economy and housing market with such pessimism that they're prioritizing partnership and stability now, deciding not to wait for the financial milestone that might never materialize? Or is this just an issue of social media amplification, where the young married couples are simply the loudest online? I'm genuinely curious if we, as millennials, overthought the process or if Gen Z is simply approaching commitment with a different, more pragmatic worldview. What are your theories? Let's talk. End quote. Okay. So this is a particularly interesting post, and it's mainly because it's very inquisitive, but I also love the fact that this guy just came out and was like, yo, this might just be social media hype, and people might just be loud online and it might not be a representation of reality, which is something that I like. A lot of people don't usually recognize that bias, but at least the fact that this guy did is something that I admire and I like quite a bit. Although, with that said, it is a particularly interesting question, because is it that Gen Z figured out something that the millennials didn't? Is it the way the millennials were raised that, has affected us? Is it something this, that, and the other that could have affected the fact that millennials are taking longer to marry or not even marrying at all, while Gen Zs seem to be marrying in a lot more numbers? Now, I did want to start off with the comments because I do believe that a lot of these comments were particularly interesting. So one of the first ones I saw was a guy who said, and I quote, "I'm a millennial and I've decided that poverty has to end in my lineage with me. It's either I end poverty or my lineage. Something's gotta give." End quote. Which I like a lot. There's the whole idea of wanting to give your kids a better life or wanting to escape poverty. So having children kind of increases the number of bills and the number of responsibilities, which can make you making money a little bit harder. And I get that. From a very logical perspective, I can get that, and a lot of millennials do have this thought process. Now, another person said, and I quote, "Gen Z has matured in an era of red pill and sprinkle sprinkle. We have also entered adulthood in an era where conservatism is trending again. Millennials entered adulthood when rebellion against societal norms were the trend. This is what shaped you." End quote. And that is particularly interesting because even though I came in as basically the last batch of millennials, or some people can even say the first batch of Gen Zs, I was basically, can I say young enough but old enough such that I encountered a lot of this, the red pill content, the sexual revolution around about the time when I was getting into dating. So it did shape a lot of my thought processes to some degree, even though I have, reshaped and unlearned and relearned some things, that it affected how I viewed relationships and how I viewed being with the opposite sex to a certain degree. So I can get why that would affect the millennials a lot more, because like when a lot of this shit was hitting, a lot of later stage millennials were in their 20s. Some of the older millennials, like the middle batch and the earlier batch, they were in their 30s and getting into their 40s. So for those that were trying to settle down, that was kind of their time. And for those that were trying to get into relationships, that was also their time. So it isn't uncommon for people to have, the whole mindset changed because of stuff like this. So it is very likely. Now, the final comment I'm gonna read says, and I quote, "My millennial friends all married before they were 30. You are comparing Gen Z who are marrying now with millennials who have chosen to be single. They are not a representative of all of the millennials." End quote. And I think I'll just stop there with the comments. And this is actually a particularly interesting take because it also emphasizes on the fact that right now Gen Zs are in their 20s. Gen Zs are within the prime time to be settling down, getting married, and setting up long-term relationships. Millennials aren't doing that right now. At least the largest bulk of millennials are well past their 30s. Actually, every single millennial, save for anyone that was born in 1996, is 30 years and above. Okay, so technically it's kind of hard to say that millennials are not getting married, because a lot of the millennials who are past the age of 30 will have quite a number of them that have gotten married, whether it's married and divorced, or married and separated, or married and stayed together. There's a lot of them that have gotten married. There is also quite a bit that are still single, but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because there's a batch of them out here who are single, that all of them are single, if you catch my drift. And with all of that said, personally speaking, I feel like this is a very tricky question to answer. And the reason why I believe that this is a very tricky question to answer is actually down to the fact that we don't have any real set of concrete reasons as to why it is millennials are or seem to be marrying a lot later or not getting married at all. Or even for the ones who are getting married, there's much fewer of them getting married because there's so many things that have happened. There's so many things that you can try to tie in, but nothing is really entirely concrete for you to be like, this is the reasoning why. And the reason I believe we don't have concrete reasons is simply because we don't have enough stats, or any for the most part, that really support the idea that millennials aren't getting married and Gen Z are getting married in droves. Because a lot of the data that I've seen, even when it comes to like Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, shows that there were a lot of millennials that were getting married over the past couple of years. And around this time, considering that a lot of the Gen Zs are in their 20s, actually most Gen Zs are in their 20s right now, then it is fairly obvious that a lot of them will be getting married. So in reality, at least as far as the statistics is showing, it doesn't really seem like that is really a thing. There's a lot of millennials in urban areas that may not be getting married as quickly or as much, but still statistically it doesn't entirely support the fact that millennials aren't getting married, or that very few are getting married, and for most of them it's very late. So it's not very easy to say that we have the stats to support this, or that the reasons for such and such happening is A, B, C, or D. But while we may not have the stats and we may not have some sort of concrete proof to actually say that this is actually entirely true, if we were to ask this question, we'd probably have a couple of reasons. Personally, for me, I tried to come up with at least a few reasons as to why it is that this is the case, and I'll try to state them out as quickly as possible, because it's not like they're just 3 points, it's like, 6 or 7. So the first one that I believe has made a lot of millennials take a little longer when it comes to settling down and getting married is the fact that we're brought up to surpass our parents. Now, a lot of millennials will tell you, or will kind of say, that they were sort of taught that, their parents brought them to a certain level, so they're supposed to pick up from that level and exceed up, not exceed down, and at the very worst, maintain that level. And for a lot of these millennials, they came up in, you can call it middle class, or at least with some sort of capability, at least on a financial level, and it's not like they were doing that badly. So for them, they want to surpass their parents, but especially the job market, especially the professional life over the past couple of years has been very unstable and very volatile, which has made it tougher for a lot of millennials to be like, I'm making good money, let me settle down and get married. Also, people are just trying to surpass their parents, so that's a reason. And when you talk of the instability, kind of leads on to the second point, where considering that we lost a lot of that job security and that stability, it just made it harder for people to settle down, because the way it was explained that there's that perfect financial moment that a lot of millennials are looking for, it just puts you in a place where you're like, I'm not in the best financial position to date or to marry and to settle down with someone right now. Just mainly not even from the idea of, you need money to, keep the relationship going, but rather when you get married, you're expected to have kids, and having those kids is going to be expensive. So, you kind of want to make sure that you at least safeguard yourself to a certain degree. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that as millennials, some of us were brought up under very, very good homes where we didn't really lack. And even though we lacked, in some bits, when it came down to the needs, they were almost always covered. We don't know how our parents did it. We don't know how much our parents struggled, but that was the case. And we would want to give the same to our kids. So it does lead on to the third point, which is, as millennials, we have standards, and Gen Zs are mostly just rolling with it. Gen Zs didn't have to worry about the whole job security and job stability thing. They kind of got into the job market, at least for the few of them that are there. They got into the job market with the instability already there. They got into, relationships knowing full well that the both of y'all are broke. Or at the very least, considering that the both of y'all are probably in your early or your mid-20s, I wouldn't even talk about the later ones who are in their late 20s, but the ones who are in the early and the mid-20s, like if they started dating and they're still in university, it's not like I'm expecting someone to be driving a car and they just joined uni. So, like, even for the babes, they probably gave more chances to guys because it's not like you're expected to be doing exceptionally well while you were still a student. Millennials, on the other hand, we have standards. You know, babes will be like, I want a provider. A man has to be a provider. I don't want to sort out bills. There's other babes that will talk about red flags and they won't care whether the red flag is the size of China or, you know, just the size of an emoji. At the end of the day, a red flag is a red flag. And as such, because no one wants to make proper compromises or understand what they're willing to compromise on because they don't want to be looked at as someone that, you know, settled for less. You know, people have set standards that are a little harder to match as opposed to Gen Zs who are mostly rolling with the punches. Even though the red flags are there, they are still rolling with the punches on some, so their chances of getting into relationships are a lot easier as opposed to some of us millennials. And one of the best parts about Gen Zs choosing to roll with the punches and, you know, kind of just, you know, get to know each other with the other person as opposed to, you know, start with a certain standard is the fact that with today's society and the shifting gender dynamics, especially when it comes to relationships and the household, Gen Z are a little bit more progressive in that they don't have to stick to the same traditional gender dynamics that millennials had seen and want the same of or want an adjustment of. So there's guys out here that want a babe that cooks and cleans, and babes are like, I'm not your mother. Why am I doing that? Get a washing machine, get a mama fua, let them come and do that shit for you. There's babes out here that are saying that a man has to be a provider and a man has to do A, B, C, D. But at the same time, there's a lot more women that are making a lot more money now than ever before. And there's a lot of guys that are having trouble catching up with that. And as such, a lot of the women that are making very good money are in positions where even though they are to try and look for someone that's on the same level or higher up, as per hypergamy, they find that the vast majority of men that are there are either taken, married, or divorced, of which the largest likelihood is if the dude is divorced or if the guy isn't, you know, married or anything, there's a pretty good chance that he might have a kid or he might have a baby mama somewhere. So it's not like it's doing them that many favors, and women choosing to shift and date down is something that a lot of them just don't want to do. And as a result, a lot of them choose to shift their interests and, you know, they decide that it's not just that. But granted, as millennials, we've also seen a lot of other things that we would like to do as opposed to just, you know, work hard, make money, get married and have, I don't know, kids and a white picket fence type shit with like maybe 1 or 2 cars. So a lot of millennials believe that there's other shit that they would like to do either before or instead of having kids. So you'll hear some millennials busy saying that they would much rather or they would want to travel the world before they get married and have kids, or instead of getting married and having kids. You'll hear others busy talking about how marriage is a scam. So as long as they can put a baby in a babe, they are free to kind of do their own thing. So they might just prefer hoeing and shit as opposed to, you know, like settling down, getting married and having like a couple of kids and shit with one person. So essentially, there's a lot of millennials that are just opting out, not necessarily because there's no options, but because they would much rather choose to do other things as opposed to getting married. And a lot of them, it seems, have gotten to the point where, now moving on to the next point, they have basically lost faith in marriage. And this isn't just from the stories online. Yes, you could say that the stories online do carry some weight, but a lot of them have gone through a bunch of shit in their homes. They've seen how the marriage has not worked in the favor of them, the kids, because they've watched their parents fight and bicker and shit. They've seen how chasing this bond that was supposedly supposed to be built on love has caused more issues than it solved. And as a result, there's a lot of them, quite a lot of millennials, that just don't want to get married because from their experience growing up, or from even just seeing some of the experiences of their friends, they just don't see it as a very good idea. And when you ask them for their reasons and why it is that they're really feeling that way, yes, they might talk about their pasts, but a lot of them will speak on the present and a lot of the stories that they've seen. Which brings me to the final point, which I believe has made a lot of millennials not want to get married, at least today. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we've been guinea pigs for different revolutions, if I can call them revolutions, and we are the generation, or at least we're the batch of people that have faced the effects as basically the early adopters. So when you look at, the results of the financial crisis of 2008, when you look at, the advent of social media, social media dating, online dating, the female sexual revolution or sexual liberation, the red pill era, like we've seen all of these things happen, and a lot of them have come to us, and the first recipients of this is usually the millennials. The first batch of Gen Zs could have experienced this as well, and maybe they might be affected, but I feel like the millennials were basically in their primes for dating and getting married when a lot of this stuff was happening, and so a lot of them could have been affected by it, and it could have altered their mindsets for good. But all in all, while I do think that those mindsets can change, I don't think that it's going to change for everyone all at the same time, especially since some of these effects might actually have fairly permanent consequences. Although, with all of that said, let me just conclude by saying this. To be honest, none of this shit matters. Because, I've given a shit ton of reasons, and I'm sure other people will add a bunch of other things, but to be very honest, none of this shit matters. There's way more reasons why millennials may take longer to marry, but the bigger question here is, why is it harder for you, if you're a single person, to find a partner and to marry at your age? I think that's a bigger question, because we can talk about millennials all the live long day, but you're not existing as a generation. You that's listening, you exist as a person. So the question is, why are you as a millennial, maybe you're interested, maybe you're not interested in marriage, unable to find a partner or not wanting to marry at this stage in your life? If you have an answer for that, then cool. But if you don't have an answer, then it's definitely something that you should think about. And I could be wrong about this, and I could be spitting out details that I don't even know throughout this entire episode. So either way, I want your thoughts on it. And I'd also want your thoughts on why you may or may not want to settle down. At least why you haven't right now. Either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On IG, it is at the Breaktime_podcast. On Facebook, it is at the Breaktime Podcast. On X, it is at Bagaka the D. And on Bluesky, it is at the breaktimepod.bsky.social. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end of this episode and this season. And I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.